So, Lone Rider here, and I have a bit of an injury to this arm, so bear with me. Well, actually, this side, some nerve thing. But I did want to put this up there. Um, I guess I won't let being um, partially, injured stop me from doing what I'm going to do. And what I wanted to talk about was the Hanwei Practical Rapier 37-inch blade. This is probably the standard in HEMA right now. Um, and this just came on the post. And I wanted to put a review up there because essentially there isn't a review of this sword in English on the internet anywhere that I could find um, that actually talks about it. Now, I haven't used this in sparring yet. I just got it. And although I have done some reading about small swords, which are of a different type of weapon, but a thrust-centric sword as well. Um, in particular, Angelo's treatise from the 1700s. I mostly do longsword, so this is a new thing to me. I've just always thought they were kind of neat. I grew up, with stories like the Three Musketeers and stuff like that, and these swords were always, to me, they were always something special. They were always something really cool. And much like longswords, they're essentially a very specialized type of weapon that was only around for a relatively short period of time. Your standard, your arming sword, as we now call it, although that wasn't a historical term, um, basically existed from the Viking period and the migration period up through the Middle Ages. Um, your longsword was a much more specialized development of that really only existed for about 100 years. And the same is true for the rapier. They existed from the mid 1500s up to the mid 1600s, basically. And, for something that was around for such a short period of time, they're just so iconic. Um, when you think of a sword fight, half the time what you're thinking of is this. When you think of, you know, historical heroes and swashbuckling and, all of that, this is the type of sword that half the time you think of. And they've certainly become very culturally iconic. I mean, just to use the example of the Three Musketeers, it's been made into movies at least 3 or 4 times that I can think of. You know, the sword itself is a little bit misunderstood, I think, and that's probably because of the thrust-centric sword that grew out of it, which was a different type of weapon. Um, but that being the small sword, and the small sword, of course, giving rise to modern sport fencing. There's, I think, a misconception. People equate this with something like a fencing foil. That's a historical example, but the modern ones aren't that different. And those are very light and very, nimble in the hand and don't weigh very much. And they're kind of light and dainty, and they're not really a historical type of weapon. They were a practice simulator for the small sword, but I mean, nobody ever carried a fencing foil in combat or fought a duel with one. They were a training analog, kind of like the side sword is. I mean, the kind of like um, the single stick was to saber. Single stick wasn't a weapon. Nobody ever used one, but it was a training analog for a saber. The fencing foil is kind of like that um, to the small sword. But for some reason, people tend to misconstrue these things as the same thing as modern fencing foil. Very probably because they are thrust centric and a lot of the moves look vaguely similar. Um, but what this is essentially a cut and thrust sword that's just been optimized for the thrust. This one, of course, is a sparring example and has that button tip. Now, I've heard that these button tips actually aren't all that safe and that they can actually scratch you up pretty bad. You have to put blunts over them, and it's kind of difficult to put a blunt over it because it's a button tip. So I may actually cut that off and just round the end. We'll see. But I'm not going to be able to do that right now because of this nerve tingling in my hand. I don't really feel like, you know, cutting on a brand new sword with tools when I'm not up to par. But that may be something I do before I use this because, like I said, it's one thing to just press it into your hand, and the blade does have some degree of flex, being a training sword. But I've heard that if you do a strike with this, this can cut people and just not pleasant. So we'll see. That said, what do I think of this? Well, these have been criticized for being very whippy, and I'm going to be honest. I wasn't quite sure what I expected. When I opened the box, I mean, I've been looking forward to this for several days. When I opened the box, I was just really psyched. I mean, I should say I've been looking forward to this all my life because the truth of the matter is, I mean, I remember when I was growing up as a kid and my dad reading me, books by Alexander Dumas and things like that. And, the rapier was always the sword that the characters had. And, the idea of having one that I could practice with and learn with. Yeah, I've been waiting for this all my life. But in particular, since I placed the order with Cult of Athena, now that was before I got injured. But fortunately, this is a one-handed sword, so that hopefully won't be that much of a problem. Historically, they were used with offhand weapons, daggers, things like that, but I just have the sword. And truthfully, the use of the sword by itself was also a historical thing. They weren't always used with left-hand daggers. They weren't always used with the offhand weapons. So what this was manufactured by Hanwei. You can see the little Hanwei stamp there on the ricasso, which is this blunt section here. And if I turn it, you can actually see how thick the ricasso is. And there's your wire-wrapped handle and your pommel. Now, the pommel is threaded on, which is about standard for Hanwei swords, including this, Tinker longsword blade. They tend to have threaded pommels, which is it's not a historical method of pommel attachment, generally speaking, but then again, this is a training sword, not a museum reproduction. So I'm not all that bothered by the fact that it doesn't have a pink pommel. If anything, it would allow you to maybe replace the blade if it got nicked up or something from practice. The point of balance is actually pretty interesting. It's right about at the end of the ricasso there. And this is the 37-inch blade. At least that's the one I ordered. The 43-inch blade tends to be the standard one, but I heard they were really whippy. And also, I'm kind of short. I'm 5'8", so I didn't feel comfortable having a really long one. I know one of the advantages of the rapier is that it's a weapon that gives you a great deal of reach. Being a thrust-centric sword, that's not a surprise, although historically they could cut. But they were obviously, optimized for the thrust. And this isn't particularly light. I mean, this weighs about what you'd expect, an arming sword to weigh or a messer. A lot of the weight's in the hilt, to be fair. And one that was intended as an actual weapon would obviously have a stiffer blade. This one, the idea is when you thrust somebody, the blade will flex. But you'll notice the flex is in the end of the blade. And, yes, if you go like this, there's a little bit of a whippiness to the blade, not much. Edge on, though, I got to be careful of the ceiling. But edge on, it's pretty dead stiff. And that's as it should be. So, I'm very happy with this. The hilt is I'm actually surprised by how small it is. I was told that these had really big hilts, and I could certainly see a weapon getting in here, through. Just use this pen as an example. I could certainly see a blade getting in here through any of these holes, perhaps, and thrusting my hand. And the idea being that you should probably wear a protective glove with this. But they said that the interwebs, the general perception on the internet by sword people, sword aficionados, historical fencers, that sort of thing, people who practice HEMA, was that the hilts on these are really big. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think they are. Um, I don't have particularly ginormous hands, but if you look at where my hand sits on here, I mean, the guard they might have been able to make the guard tighter to the hand to have less room in here, for example, and maybe less openings here. Although the whole point of a swept hilt is that while it provides you some coverage, it is also fairly open. But in terms of the grip length in particular and the way the finger fits over the cross guard, if you're going to go for that kind of a grip, which tends to be historical with rapiers, I don't feel like I'm reaching to put my finger over the quillion in this part of the sword hilt. I don't feel like there's not a lot of room here. In fact, if you look at this, when I just have my 3 back fingers on the grip itself and the forefinger over the quillion, my hand basically ends where the grip ends. There's not a lot of extra room there. Can you grip it like this? Yes. But then the very bottom of your palm is bottoming out on the pommel. And of course, if you look at how your hand goes when you're in a thrusting position this way, it feels much more awkward. I feel tension here that I shouldn't feel. You go like this, and it allows you to bring the sword more, the point more in line with your arm, so that it's less of an awkward position for delivering a thrust. Now, the blade is flexible. One of the criticisms that people have had, other than the hilt, is that the blades are too soft and that they wiggle. The criticism is that it's a jiggly sword. It waves around like a soft, flexible fencing foil. I haven't seen that. The blade does have a lot of flex in it, but again, edge on, which is how you'd be hopefully parrying, it's not that bad. Is there flex in the blade? Yes, but would I be comfortable using this to spar rapier? I think I would. I think it could be stiffer. I'm kind of surprised that it's not stiffer, maybe to about here. But, the fact that this has some flex in it, most of the flex, if you look at the blade, is in the thrust is going to be at the end. So I think a lot of the criticisms of this as related to the blades being too floppy and jiggly, they were based on the 43-inch blade, and that's longer than this. This thing actually, if I can get my handy-dandy measuring tape, and this ruler rather, and this ruler, this yardstick only goes up to 35 inches, but if I start at the end of the guard here, you'll notice that from the end of the guard to the end of the blade, this is actually only 34.5 inches. The blade measured from the cross is further, and that puts it at just about 36 inches. So I'm not sure why this was sold as having a 37-inch blade. Maybe if you went past this little triangular point all the way to the very end, as if the cross was flush, maybe that would give you 37 inches. But just from the cross, it's 36. And from the outside of the guard, pretty much the end of the ricasso, I mean, the ricasso continues about 1.5 inches past the guard, but if you just start with the end of the guard there, you get to about 34.5 inches, which, historically these blades tended to be between 37, 38 inches and 40-something inches. 42, 43, 45, I've heard as being particularly normal. Obviously, there was a range, just like any sword type. The whole point is to have a long blade and a long reach, so, it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of them were more intended to have longer blades, but there's also the issue of proportion. I mean, if you're somebody like me, I'm not particularly tall, so I'm going to have a shorter blade. Uh, and if a 37-inch blade is historically, where they started, then this being sold as having a 37-inch blade, that sounds about right to me. It is interesting to actually measure the blade, though, and if you're measuring from the guard, it's not 37 inches, it's 34 and a half. And if you're actually measuring from where the edges start, even though they're blunt edges because it's a training weapon, measuring from the end of the ricasso, wow, you've got a 33-inch blade. So that's not different than many arming swords. Whereas, of course, traditionally a rapier is supposed to be a lot longer. So, this is shorter, and that may be one of the reasons why it doesn't seem to have as much floppiness in the blade, despite the fact that it does have flex. I would argue that something like this probably is intended to have more flex than a long sword or an arming sword for sparring purposes, because while you do thrust with a long sword and an arming sword, a lot of the times you're delivering cuts. Whereas with this, you may deliver cuts, but you're also delivering thrusts, and you're in fact relying a lot more on the thrust than you would. So just like for example, the blade you would use for a small sword simulator, we typically use shortened junior epee blades for that. Those tend to be a lot more flexible than a sparring longsword. I would argue that something like this would probably be expected to be more flexible, at least towards the end of the blade, than a sparring longsword. And it certainly is. The longsword I spar with is not nearly as flexible as this. But then again, you don't thrust nearly as much with the longsword as you do with something like this. And it's also generally accepted that for things like rapier or perhaps light military saber, that you use less protective gear. You don't need as thick a jacket or a gambeson. You might not need as protective gloves or gauntlets. Instead of some kind of a ginormous heavy glove like a Spez Heavy or a sparring glove, you might be able to get by with Red Dragons or lacrosse gloves, etc. So, now that said, would it hurt to get hit with something like this? Undoubtedly. But, especially in the thrust, it is intended to be flexible. I mean, keep in mind they're going to make it more suited to its intended use, and its intended use is a thrust-centric weapon, a cut and thrust sword that's mainly intended for the thrust, but can also cut. Now, historically, there were different schools of thought regarding rapiers and the cut and thrust. Some people cut with them a lot more than others. A lot of the earlier schools, I mean, Mayer's rapier, it's really more like side sword fighting from what I've read. But yeah, I'm very happy with this, and I definitely can't wait to use it. I'm almost I'm almost reluctant to think about using it because the truth is that it's so nice and shiny now. But you've got a nice, solid, substantial guard. You've got a good grip. People have talked about wire wrap grips being uncomfortable. This one actually is pretty comfortable even in a bare hand. Obviously, I'd be wearing gloves if I was practicing with this, but to save my hands. But it is very comfortable on the bare palm. And like I said, people talk about the hilt being really large. It is open. There are gaps here. But as far as large goes, I don't think so. I think maybe it could be tighter to the hand, but the room for the hand, especially along the grip and in terms of the reach to the quillion for the finger, is perfectly sufficient for somebody like me who's not a giant. So, yeah, I'm very happy with this sword. I'm thinking it's pretty cool. Can't wait to try it out. Let's see, what else would I say? I would point out that the guard is asymmetrical, so if you're a lefty like me, keep in mind most of the protection is going to be on the side of the hand where you actually need it less. This is designed with righties in mind, so you have more of the meat of your hand on this side, so you have more protection here. You do have, however, plenty of protection still on this side. And, it's a little more open, but not much. And if you were sparring with gloves, I imagine that wouldn't be all that much of a problem. Um, so, we'll see what happens. And I could always take a piece of thin plastic or something and just, insert it there and tie it to the edges to cover that gap, just to provide, sort of a plate. If I was all that concerned about that. I know, for example, with a lot of early basket hilt swords, they solved the issue of points going through the gaps by having thick leather liners. Um, Now, that's not historical as far as I understand on swept hilts, but since I'm essentially using a righty sword left-handed, you know, having something there maybe might not be a bad idea, or maybe just, wearing the aforementioned gloves. I mean, if I'm wearing, Red Dragons or lacrosse gloves with this, that might be sufficient, combined with the fact that it's a, fairly robust hilt, and a lot more protective hilt than a simple crossguard like you'd find on a longsword or an arming sword. So, um, yeah, this is pretty damn cool. I'm liking it. Like I said, this is new out of the box. I haven't used it yet, but I wanted to just get something down because uh, in the run up to me getting my hands on one of these, I looked everywhere and I couldn't find a single review of this in English anyway. I think there was one that was in like German or Swedish or something. I couldn't find a single English review of this sword on YouTube or whatever, doing a search. I found one uh, from Blood and Iron, which is the Canadian historical fencing group that's associated with Skallagrim, where they basically talked about how the long-bladed ones sucked because they were too floppy and they broke and blah blah blah. But then again, I remember seeing Skal Gladiatoria's video where he had a long-bladed one. He actually tried to cut it in half with other swords and failed to do so. He damaged it, but he wasn't able to break it. So, and he was specifically trying to do so. So, um, but as far as a review of the sword and a description of the, in particular, of the hilt and how it feels, uh, in a close up of it, I have not been able to find anything of that sort. So I just wanted to put this up there, just so there is something. And Hanwei is known for its inexpensive entry level swords, and in particular their practical line of their sparring swords. And this is certainly no exception, but I will say that it's a very clean looking hilt. If you look at this, you don't see giant weld marks. You don't see, I mean, this is it's a very plain hilt. There's not a lot of decoration or engraving or anything like that beyond the flutes on the pommel and the wire wrap. It's pretty plain. But the shape is pleasing to the eye. It is well executed, and it does appear to be very sturdy. And in particular, you look at the thickness of that ricasso. This is not a flimsy blade. So I did want to put something up because, like I said, I couldn't find anything myself when I was looking. And this is probably one of the most popular um, swords for people doing HEMA who want a rapier simulator, who want a rapier practice blade. So there we go. Lone Rider out.